If you have ears to hear, hear. Two people went to the temple to pray. One, a pious, devout, religious person, a Pharisee, prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. The other person, the tax collector, could hardly pray. He beat upon his chest, crying out, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Two people were in church on Sunday. One, a longtime member, a former vestry person, a frequent teacher of the Bible, leader of some important committees of the church, why even he taught 6th grade Sunday school boys class for confirmation. And he prayed, God, I thank you that my parents raised me in the church, taught me the Bible as a youth, planted in my heart a love and a commitment to your teachings. I give 10% off the top, volunteer each month at one of my parish's outreach ministries. And there was a second person in this church, seated near the rear of the church, and he spoke silently, almost to himself, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you see, that was all that he knew to say, because when his business went broke and his marriage dissolved, this man decided, on a whim, to go to his neighborhood church. Nobody asked him. He was just that desperate. But he felt lousy at prayer. He really didn't know which words to say, and he certainly didn't know when to stand or when to sit or when to kneel. And so after this worship service was over, these two men had remarkably different reactions. Quite frankly, the longtime member didn't get much out of the service at all. Something was missing. The hymns were not his favorite. The preaching was rather conventional and a bit too long. Oh, well, he thought, perhaps next week. The other man, however, stayed seated in the back pew long after the dismissal. He was overcome with emotion and not even sure that his tears were of joy or of grief. He could not explain what had just happened to him during the service. All he could say to the altar guild as they were cleaning up and the sexton as he was turning out the lights was, God loves me. God forgives me. Today's gospel is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collectors, and it is a reminder that the fact that there are two kinds of parables at least, especially in Luke's gospel. Some parables that we have, like the one we heard last week, are clear example stories. Because if you remember, last week we heard the story of a persistent widow who pestered a careless judge. And Luke says that Jesus told this parable to show that the people, quote, ought to pray always and not to lose heart. Therefore, we are called to keep at prayer, just like that widow. And this parable that we had last week, that is, urges us to act in a certain way. But there are other types of parables, and I think most of them would fall into this category, that do not urge us to do anything. They are glimpses of God. These sorts of parables are not an example of the way that we are to behave, but rather a depiction of the way that God acts. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collectors is more about the grace of God than anything else. And so let's revisit this parable, but this time I want you to watch not the actions of the Pharisee and the tax collector, but rather the actions of God. Two people come before the presence of God, and God comes real close to one and not to the other. The tax collector, the one portrayed as the bad guy, is justified, made right with God. The good guy goes home empty. Why is that? I don't know. And I'm not being flippant. This is a parable about God and not about us. And so I think the question remains, why did God bless one and not the other? And I still don't know. But I will say this. The tax collector wasn't trying to be humble. He was humble. He wasn't acting like he didn't know how to pray. He really didn't know how to pray. He wasn't pretending that he didn't know what to do in church. He really didn't know what to do in church. Friends, it is important for us to know just how down, just how low this tax collector really was. Because after defrauding his neighbors on behalf of the Roman treasury, he had much to be humble about. He was a sinner, personally and corporately. Now, I don't know how many of us relate to this tax collector, but I am guessing that some of us come to church not knowing whether or not we should even be here. And there are probably some Sundays when we look around and we notice that everyone else looks so righteous, so close to God, so near to getting it right. And so when it comes time for pray, we don't know what words to use because we're empty and we're humbled. And the good news I want to proclaim to you this morning is that this is often when God meets us and blesses us. Perhaps, just perhaps, not always, but sometimes when you are on top of the world, when you have a ready verse on the tip of your tongue, when prayer comes easily, then maybe you realize you don't need the gift of God. I mean, what can God possibly do for you? God, I'm thankful that I'm not needy, empty, confused, like some people I know. But if you are humble, that's a beautiful word, humble, from the word hummus, which simply means down close to the earth, empty-handed, unsteady, unsure, then maybe this parable is yours. And if it is, rejoice and hold out your hands to receive this gift given to you. It is a gift called grace. Unmerited, undeserved, unearned. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. You see, nobody asked Jesus for this parable. And I don't think a lot of us, myself included, care all that much for this story. But as New Testament scholar Will Willimon, who is right here, says, this is a parable of diminishing returns. The longer we have been Christians, the less we like the story. And Willimon also says it's a parable of increased need. The longer we have been Christians, the more we need this story. But you see, here's our dilemma as I see it. We keep wanting Jesus to say, I've come to gather the good and to reward the righteous, and I want to start the line right over there on the first pew. And yet what Jesus is saying is this: I've come to seek and to save the lost. I've come to call the sinners. I'm here for the sick. One final story before we move on. I was the rector of Christ Church in Tuscaloosa for a number of years, and it was a vibrant church in part because we had so many faculty members and administrators and students from the University of Alabama in our congregation. And I had a special admiration for one administrator in particular. Her name was Kathleen Kramer. And I absolutely admired Kathleen because I think she had the most challenging job one could ever imagine. She was the head compliant officer for the Greek system at the university. And that means she was the point person for all of those crises that happened. And on occasion, she would call me and she would say, "Now, Mike, we have a crisis at such and such fraternity house or sorority house." It was usually a fraternity house. And she would say to me, "And I need you down there." And then she always would end with this phrase, "And Mike, remember to put on your collar." And so one year, it was Palm Sunday afternoon, I remember, she calls me with a fraternity crisis. And I say, "Kathleen, I cannot go down to the fraternity house this afternoon. It is Palm Sunday. It is the beginning of Holy Week, the busiest time of the church year. But Mike, you don't understand. We really need you down there. Last night there was a party and some sofas caught on fire and the fire department was called and the president of the university is furious. And Mike, don't forget to wear your collar." And so on Palm Sunday afternoon, the beginning of Holy Week, the busiest time of the church year, I attended this 2-hour meeting at the fraternity house. And you can only imagine the level of conversation. "So, you were there when the sofas caught on fire?" they were asked. "Well, it was a misunderstanding," they said. And so I'm at this meeting thinking this: what is a person like me doing among people like these on a Sunday like this? I am a preacher, not a probation officer. And finally, this meeting ended. And I headed for the door, and I passed a young man that was propped up against the wall, and he looked sort of familiar to me. And I looked at him a second time, and then he spoke to me. "Hey, Father, that was a killer sermon today at church." And I was stunned. "Oh, you go to church? You go to Christ Church downtown Tuscaloosa?" "Sure," he said. "I'm there most Sundays at the 11 o'clock service. I sit in the back row." And George, and he points to a guy who's sort of in this inappropriate t-shirt, very beefy guy who reminded me of John Belushi in the Animal House. And he says, "George, he goes with me sometimes." Now, George said that he liked your sermon a few weeks ago more than the one today, but I really needed to hear the one that you preached today. It was as if God really spoke to me. 2 men went to the church to pray. One an Episcopal priest, the other a fraternity sophomore. 2 men went back home after the service, one to the rectory, the other to the fraternity house. As Luke tells us today, the latter was justified, meaning made right by God, not the former. If you have ears to hear, hear.